Hey guys, it's Libby. I'm coming to you live to me from Costume College in my underwear at the moment. That's because today we're doing a special video. I guess this is technically a get ready with me video, as I am about to get ready for day 2 of Costume College. Actually, I suppose it's technically day 3, the Saturday of Costume College, in which we'll be wearing some Regency clothes. And since this is Jane Austen July, I thought I would make a Jane Austen related video to go with my Jane Austen related clothing. Now I am not participating in Jane Austen July because I don't have time to read this month with Costume College and then Penzic coming up in July and August. In July, I am not a reader, I am a seamstress. But this year I have been working on a lot of early Regency things. So I have felt very close to Jane Austen and her characters, although I have not been reading their stories. I have instead been more like living their lives. So at the moment I'm dressed in my shoes and stockings, which you have to put on before you put on your stays because it's a little hard to bend over once you have the stays on. And then I have my linen shift. Now in this period, late 18th, early 19th century, we have the shift in English from the word shift. I thought I said something wrong, but it was like, no, we just use the word shift in 2 different ways. From the word shift to the word chemise, which is the French word, and because shift was considered kind of vulgar. And the shift was called a shift because you shifted it, ideally every day. People didn't bathe as much as they do now, but what they did instead was basically cover their body with linen, which is really good at absorbing sweat and dirt and oils. And so what happens is all day, you sweat into the linen, and then you take it off and wash it, and all that dirt goes away, and you put on a nice new clean thing the next day. I monogram all of my shifts. This one is done in white on white, so it's a little hard to see. But this was a common practice if you lived in a house with multiple women, as many of Austen's heroines do, so that when you're doing the laundry, you can easily tell like what's your shift and what's your mom's shift. Next thing I'm going to put on is my stays, which some of you may be thinking of as a corset. And for those of you who watch my historical fiction cover costume reviews, you've probably heard me talk about spiral lacing versus crisscross lacing. Here you will see an example of me doing spiral lacing, because you can see the holes for the lacing, the top one and the bottom one. Oh, you can't see that, but they're even, and then all of the other ones are offset because I'm going to use one string to go around and around like that, which is what they did until 18 teens, 20s. So this is a fairly early model of stay. Normally I get into it better than this. Ugh, okay. So late 18th, early 19th century is a time of lots of experimentation in corsetry. Fashion had changed a lot, and so the undergarments that went with it also had to change a lot. Let's see. So you can really tell a lot by what time period a garment is from based on what the silhouette is. I'm confused. Here we go. Now, for a lot of Jane Austen's novels, it's not really clear what time they're set at. Notable exception is Persuasion. We get specific dates for that because the antecedent events occurred in the year 6, and then we are 8 years later. I really hope it's 8 years later and I'm not getting this wrong in a video for Jane Austen buffs. So Persuasion is mostly taking place in 1814. The others, it's a bit harder to tell. And it's not helped by the fact that in many cases Austen wrote them several years before they were published. Northanger Abbey, I feel reasonably comfortable in saying, is actually set in the very late 1790s because at one point Isabella gives a list of recommended reading to Catherine, and all of the books she lists are published before 1799. So I think if it was taking place after 1799, she would have included some more recent Gothic novels. There's now going to be about 5 minutes of boob adjustment, which I don't want to put on the internet, so brace for cut. So my stays are trending more towards the 18th century style as opposed to the 19th century style, and that's partially because they are from quite early in what we call the Regency period in terms of fashion, which is slightly different than the Regency period in terms of politics. The front is fully boned with reed and the back is partially boned, and it creates a very straight front silhouette, which was the fashion in about 1798 and only 1798. It was a very brief fashion period because the fashion was for very short bodices, which were basically shorter than the distance between nipple and bottom of sternum. So there was really no space to actually have a curve for the bust. So you basically just had the waistline sitting really high, not really under the bust, but sort of at an artificially created point, which is being created by the stays. So that was fashionable very briefly, but these stays stayed in use for quite a while, particularly in the United States. My stays are actually a pretty close copy of a pair in, I think, Massachusetts from the late 18th century. And the United States at this point was still a total backwater. People were not being fashionable. They were not achieving, the most fashionable silhouettes that they were doing in Britain and France. So I would say plausibly Catherine Morland is wearing stays like these, and also maybe Fanny Price's mother, if she's keeping her old stays for longer than they stay in fashion. But most Austen heroines would probably be wearing something nicer than these. Next layer is the petticoat, which had just recently changed its meaning when Jane Austen was writing. So in the 18th century, the petticoat was a garment that you would see. Gowns would open down the front, and you would pin them closed in front, but then they would open over the skirt, the petticoat, and you could see it underneath. But by the time Austen's writing, the petticoat is really an undergarment, because gowns are, for the most part, closed in front. And not a lot of them have survived, probably because they are such nice large panes of fabric, so when they stop being used as petticoats, they can be cut up into something else. So we don't really know what petticoats looked like from really late 1790s, early 1800s. We know that later versions had full bodices and sometimes sleeves as well. But for my purposes, I've gone with the easy version of just using straps, with the idea that potentially this could have been a petticoat in what we think of as, the 18th century period of costuming, where you're just wearing it at your waist because it's actually short enough to go that it doesn't hit the floor when I wear it at my waist. And then I just added straps onto it to lift it up when the waistline moves up. Now, the most famous petticoat in Jane Austen is, of course, Elizabeth Bennet's, which gets covered in how many inches of mud? 3 inches of mud? 6 inches of mud? I don't pay quite as close attention to these things as Caroline Bingley. So what I think is happening there is that she's got quite a long petticoat, because I think Caroline mentioned something about Elizabeth is trying to cover up the messiness of her petticoat with her skirt. So I'm guessing what happened was on Elizabeth's muddy walk to Netherfield, she was, when she walked through mud, she would hitch up her skirt, but leave her petticoat long, which she would do in case anyone saw you walking. It's not the worst thing in the world if someone sees your petticoat, but if someone sees your only stocking-clad leg, that might be a bit of a problem. And in fact, the idea that underwear definitely had to be concealed was not particularly a Georgian one. So here's the dress I'm going to be wearing later this evening. And the way you put it on is you fasten the lining in front. You put it on like a coat, basically, and then you pin the lining together in front. And then you just tie the gown over it, which means you still have this big slit, which sort of sits closed, but you don't pin it closed. It's not fastened in any way, and obviously it's pretty prominent right here. But if someone sees through the slit, they're just going to see petticoat. They're not going to see skin or anything sexy like that. So people seeing your petticoat was not a scandal. And I think this point is probably a good time to put up my hair. So I'll do that real fast. I'm doing a more sort of middle class look, so I'm not going to do any fancy curls in the front. I'm just going to put it up in a bun, and then I'm going to put a cap on top because I am married, and married women have to cover their hair. Or have a thing on their head. You don't have to conceal your hair. So the next thing I'm going to be putting on is my kerchief, which is a daytime garment to fill in the neckline. And this serves many purposes. So it conceals your chest, which is not really a modesty thing so much as a avoiding sunburn thing, and in the winter, a keeping warm thing. And also, this is another example of linen, or in this case, it's actually cotton. They were sort of moving towards cotton in more cases as you move through the 19th century. Let's do the cap. There we go. It's a little dopey. And I'm going to pin it into my bun, just so it doesn't fly away. Yeah, so the kerchief is another thing that stands between your skin and the dress because you don't really want to wash your dress. It's quite fragile, especially if it's like made of silk. Mine here is made of cotton, but you really don't want to be washing your silk dresses that often, if ever. So instead, you would wash this. Now when I say pin, I mean with a straight pin. I'm just gonna stick it, let's see. I think I'm gonna leave mine slightly open and pin right on top of the centermost bones in the stays, so that if the pins do turn in on me at all, they'll be turning into a reed, and the reed is sturdy enough to stop it from going into my skin. And since I have a front closing corset, I can't get it exactly in the middle unless I do each side separately. If you have a back closing corset, you could overlap these and pin them together. Okay, so the next thing that goes on is going to be my gown. This is based off of one in the Manchester City Gallery, so I call it my Manchester dress. I'm not totally sure if it was actually worn in Manchester. Let's emerge on the other side. Nope. I probably should have done this before I put my cap on because it fell off. Now, back closing dresses are actually a little bit later of an invention than the time I'm going for. So this new style of dressmaking with the raised waist required a bit of creativity for people who were used to making 18th century gowns. And they solve these problems in many different ways. A particularly English way of solving it is what's called a bib front or an apron front or a drop front gown. So first I'm going to adjust it so it's far forward enough. So the way this gown works is I have the skirt and then I have the underbodice, which could pin closed. In this case, I'm going to lace it closed. And then that front opening one that I showed you, that style was more popular in France. So I've tied this one in front, and I'm actually going to pin the underbodice to my stays as well. I don't think they did this a lot in the Regency period, but I have to do it because I made my shoulder straps too short, and so if I don't, the bodice will ride up. It is hard to turn a pin when it is going against some stays. And now the original dress that I am copying, we think was actually made of a much older fabric that had been made into a gown and then was remade for the new fashions. So this printed cotton, this floral printed cotton, is kind of old-fashioned. And This thing, my evening gown, is much more fashionable. So this is made of a type of cotton, which is as close as I could get to Georgian muslin. I'll show you one layer so you can see that it's, well, you can't see it so well on camera, but oh yes you can. Okay, so it's fairly sheer. Muslin was made of cotton. Cotton manufacture was increasing, and so you could get these like really finely woven cotton threads, which were then woven to very delicate fabrics. And Northanger Abbey fans will of course know all about muslin because Mrs. Allen goes on about muslins for quite a while with Mr. Tilney. So this evening I think we'll be channeling Mrs. Allen a bit. Let's see, I'm going to tuck these strings into my petticoat just so they don't create lumps or anything. And now I'll show you how the bib front works. So here's the front of the skirt. I'm going to tie it behind my back, and then here's the bib, which flips up and attaches with buttons. The other instance where you hear people specifically mention dress in Jane Austen, because Jane Austen doesn't like to talk about clothes a whole lot. She'll often just say, you know, she was wearing a dress or a hat. And then since she lived in the 19th century, obviously she knew and she expected her readers to know what she was talking about. But it's slightly different for us today when we're reading her books. One button, two button. So at one point in Mansfield Park, Fanny is given a new dress by her uncle for a ball, and Edmund compliments the spangly bits or the glossy bits, which I'm guessing she was wearing white or another pastel, made of probably cotton but with bits of silk woven in probably a satin type way. It's possible that these are metallic threads, like metallic gold or metallic silver, but that would be a very fine dress, which I wouldn't expect Sir Thomas to buy for his, you know, not his actual child. And now, of course, we have to accessorize. As I said before, Georgians were very into symmetry, so you would never wear a bracelet on one wrist. You'd always wear matching bracelets on both wrists. This is coral jewelry made of coral beads, which was very popular and fairly inexpensive. Georgians mostly seem to have been more interested in there being some glitz, some sort of pop of color or sparkle, as opposed to being hyper-focused on the preciousness of the jewels. So wearing paste jewelry was not really frowned upon. Paste is sort of, well, you basically make a paste, and then when it sets, it looks like a glass or like a jewel. So I've got my little tiny coral parure, and I'm going to finish it off with, this is maybe a little bit later than what I'm going for, but it's nice and the hotel is cold. So I'm going to add a paisley shawl. Paisley was initially being woven in India, but it was so popular that people in Britain and France attempted to learn how to weave their own paisley so they didn't have to pay the exorbitant rates from a foreign country. So now we can take a look at the whole thing. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I am happy to answer any questions you may have in the comments. And if you want to see more of my historical costumes, you can go to my Instagram, which is at Venerable Fashions, Venerable_Fashions.